Good afternoon and welcome to the Great Exhibition Road Festival. I'm Helen Sharman and really just delighted that I've been asked to chair this festival panel discussion today. It's been initiated by Imperial College London's Institute for Security Science and Technology. Now, we're recording the panellists, but not anything of the audience, so don't worry, for a special edition of the Zero Pressure podcast. Now, this is something that I host. Zero Pressure's presented by the same Institute for Security Science and Technology, and Saab, so they do it together. I host it, and it looks at how science and technology positively can contribute to solving the complex, interrelated global challenges of today and tomorrow. Now, in this next episode, the one that we're recording, we're turning our attention to the top and bottom of the world. Now, I think probably you've all heard of some of the direct environmental impacts that are being felt at the poles as a result of climate change, ice melting, for instance. But as we're going to find out today, climate change threats to these very fragile lands are many and various. And the polar regions are much more than an environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. There are threats to communities' ways of life. There's a potential to influence global food security and other global matters as well. And there are concerns around international conflict points. So, in this discussion, we're going to be exploring hot topics such as geopolitical tensions and land ownership disputes in these coldest parts of our planet, and how science and technology can rise to the challenges that we face. But before we get started, I'd like to just remind you all that this is an interactive conversation. There'll be time for you to ask questions in the second part of this event, so do get thinking what you'd like to ask. But if that's all right with everybody, let's get started by meeting our panel. Now, Angus Naylor, sitting just next to me here, is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Victoria in British Columbia and a recipient of the University of Leeds' 2022 Piers Sellers Prize. You might remember Piers Sellers as a British-American astronaut who was a meteorologist and an environmentalist. Angus's research involves working with communities in Inuit Nunangat, did I pronounce that right? In Arctic Canada, to understand the effects that climate change, environmental contaminants, and wider socio-political factors have on food security and Inuit hunting success. And then next to Angus, with a career in the Royal Navy, Sean Trevethan is the maritime lead in defence investments at NATO headquarters. Sean's work often involves the polar regions. For instance, he's involved in the winterization of warships for Arctic operations, and he's working towards the exploitation of autonomous systems, that's vehicles without people to you and me, to monitor the seas, including the Southern and Arctic Oceans. And finally, on the end there is Dylan Banks, who's a physicist and a bioengineer turned entrepreneur. He's worked on several remote sensing projects in polar regions, and he's the founder of Iceni Labs, Future by Insects, which is not just about eating insects, Dylan tells me, and Liberty Produce. Dylan says he's driven by a commitment to a sustainable human future and building the technological innovations that will deliver it. So let's give a round of applause to our panel, I think so. Now, I'm going to start off with Dylan on the end there. So as someone who's been involved in monitoring environmental change in polar regions, can you just tell us briefly what you've been able to measure that's a result of climate change?
So we've assisted with a number of environmental monitoring programs in Arctic Canada, in the Arctic through the European pathways to there, and also in the Antarctic. My specific role in each of those was to do, in the northern regions, was to assist with human physiological monitoring. And the projects were either for working environments in those regions. So in respect of Canada, they were exploration and understanding about some of the geological capabilities of what can be found under the ground. And in respect of Arctic exploration out of Norway, well, from the European region, they were to collect some ice core samples. And the outputs of those ice core samples resonated and correlated with the outputs of ice core samples as have been taken both in the northern and southern hemisphere. And of course, those things show direct and significant differences in the climate as they were back then and the climate as they are right now. The ways in which these things are analysed in the instances in which we were taking them is that the samples are taken, and in those samples are tiny little bubbles, air bubbles, that can be melted and then analysed. And so the concentration of gases that are found in the air there can be compared to the concentration of gases that are found or measured today. And by doing that, we can understand that gases are very different in terms of their concentrations back then and they are today. And as we all know, I'm sure, we've got far more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now than we do then.
Thank you. I think we'll come back back onto carbon and carbon dioxide a bit later on. Angus, just in a couple of minutes or so, can you tell us a bit about how climate change is affecting the way of life of people whose communities have lived in these areas in the Arctic for hundreds, possibly even thousands of years?
Yeah, of course. So human settlement in the Arctic, indigenous peoples have inhabited the Arctic for at least sort of around 20,000 years. And a lot of the issues and climate change impacts that indigenous communities are experiencing are closely tied to a lot of the other issues that we talk around when we think about geopolitics or, NATO, maritime movement, but also issues around food security, as you mentioned. So the climate in the Arctic specifically is warming at 2 to 4 times the global annual average, which is 0.2 degrees per decade. That's the average.
So that's the average for the whole of the world?
That's the average for the whole of the world, and then the Arctic is warming, depending on where you look in the Arctic, around 2 to 4 times that. So it can be 0.4 to 0.8 degrees per decade. And then, looking forward into the future, we are looking at quite severe projections for the Arctic, depending on how much climate change mitigation we do, so how much CO2 we stop adding into the atmosphere. In indigenous communities specifically, what this warming climate manifests as is reduced sea ice. Sea ice is incredibly important for indigenous communities to actually hunt. So indigenous communities in this part of the Arctic, it's very difficult to actually buy store-bought food, so they largely rely on subsistence hunting. So what I mean by that is going out on ice and harvesting seals, polar bears, fishing from ice, lake ice as well, but also sea ice. So that kind of thing when we talk about food. So actually accessing food is becoming more difficult. But also with changes in sea ice, we are seeing the ecosystems of animals that indigenous people rely on for food also becoming more fragile and more at risk. So seals, for instance, rely on, they pup or they give birth, and then the seals are in a sort of a den, which is on ice and it's built out of snow. So a warming climate can affect the integrity of the den that the seals are in, which can cause a collapse within the den and the death of younger seals, which then obviously impacts the ecosystem more broadly, but also indigenous people's ability to go and harvest them. Another example of an impact could be permafrost. The loss of permafrost is going to put more methane and CO2 into the atmosphere, but it also affects the ability to construct infrastructure and how infrastructure that already exists in the Arctic is affected by that. So an example of a community in Alaska is that they're now needing to move based on the fact that permafrost change is affecting that. And also increased wave action from reduced sea ice is basically washing some communities in Alaska away. So they're now having to move, but actually finding a substrate where you can place a community becomes more difficult because you can't just move it onto another area of permafrost because you will encounter the same problems again. So you have to look for rock, and that becomes much more expensive.
Okay, it might just be worth mentioning, I think, so you mentioned methane. So the permafrost contains a lot of methane as well as carbon dioxide, doesn't it? And methane is a very potent global warming gas, climate change. So that's one of the reasons why the Arctic certainly is melting faster than the rest of the world. And is the other reason that, perhaps you might know a bit about this, Dylan, that because ice reflects so much light and therefore heat as well back into space, that when we melt a bit of ice, we have much less heat reflected, so even more rapid warming. Is that the idea of why the poles are warming quicker? I'm sort of putting 2 and 2 together and making 5 here. I'm looking to people who know better than me, really.
I think there's a whole combination of effects in respect of global weather patterns as well as direct aspects to do with those environments. So in respect of the trapped methane in the permafrost regions, that can add positively to a positive feedback system, whereby as more is released, more heating can happen. And just partly to do with the mechanism of the weather patterns, the poles of the Earth are well, they're very fragile in terms of their where heat is stored and moved around the whole of the planet, and it's partly because of that their heating is seen more in those regions than it is in the on average in the rest of the world, and it's particularly seen in the Arctic.
Thank you. Okay, and finally, Sean. So, can you briefly, for now, I'm sure we'll come back for some of the details, but how has climate change, and in particular the melting of the ice caps, affected the way that NATO considers the poles with respect to global security?
Yes, so I think it'd be remiss of me not to go back to sort of recent NATO strategy and say that there are really, you could split it down into two elements within NATO for consideration. One is, as a political military alliance, how do we do our bit for the mitigation against climate change? So there is a lot of work ongoing looking at alternative fuels, alternative refrigerant gases, etc., for the types of equipment, and then the wider footprint. And that would be one method inside. And then the key one, which is related to our output, is the security implications that you've referenced there. Obviously, the melting of the ice caps in the high north create more waterways, and they create effectively a greater area for NATO to cover in terms of its situational awareness. And if over the last, I would say, at least two decades, there's been systemic or structural underfunding to nations' defence forces. Therefore, the number of assets that we have available to cover the area that we are interested in as an alliance have reduced in number, which means we've got to look at different ways and newer technologies to cover more ground than we did do before.
Do you also have to consider what other activities people might be able to do? So if you've got more ground to cover, presumably that means that there's more ground for other people could possibly cover. So I'm thinking also possibly the commercial side of going into the Arctic, or as well as military, I guess.
Absolutely, and the thing is with climate change in the round and its security considerations within NATO, we are looking at effectively competition for resources becoming kind of fierce and sporadic as the global climate changes, not just in the poles, but also in other regions, potentially where water levels might rise and people's food sources might be taken away from them. Inherently, when it comes to disaster relief, a lot of nations' militaries fulfill that role. So it's making sure that the militaries within the alliance have the capability and surge capacity to do that. And then when it comes to the high north, obviously the population is a lot lower. There is the prediction of the competition for resource. There's no Arctic treaty per se like there is an Antarctic treaty. And what that means is we've got to consider things like the UN CLOS and IMO regulations as being the only kind of rule of law that we have to abide. Here we go. The United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. It's a good question. And these are enshrined in international law, and our best chance we've got as an alliance to kind of maintain order in that region. However, it's not specific. They weren't specifically written for the events that we foresee unfolding in the next few decades.
Wow. I mean, is it, I suppose, it's sort of becoming a naive concept now to think of Antarctica and the Arctic as these lovely, pristine environments that are supposedly off limits to everyone other than a few scientists and the occasional explorer? I mean, was it ever true, do you think?
What, in terms of being off limits?
Or that it was they were pristine environments?
Well, I think that my colleagues to my left and right would have a better answer, but I can certainly, I would hazard, or make the statement that they were far less accessible. And we look at how far and how much Shackleton did in the Antarctic, and not many have replicated his journey, although they have done, but it's still a very difficult and very harsh environment. So they will remain remote, but become increasingly more accessible by technologies as they develop.
What do you think, Angus?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. I think when we talk about pristine and preserving a pristine environment, I think the Antarctic Treaty System kind of buys into the idea that the Arctic is a pristine environment, it needs to be conserved, and everything should be put back the way it is. But yes, fundamentally, the Arctic is very much a changing place. Conserving it is, of course, very important, but we do need to remain cognizant that it is changing. The Antarctic is changing, the Arctic is changing. And yeah, I think that's something that I think in the British consciousness, especially when we think about the Arctic and the Antarctic, we think about ice. We think about that picture up there, which I think for the Antarctic, yes, ice is much more prevalent year-round. In parts of the Arctic, the ice in the community where I work in Inuktitut, by July, August time, the vast majority of the ice is gone. The snow is gone. It's more grey. There is vegetation. There's greenery. So there is, I think when we think about the Arctic and the pristine nature of the Arctic, we often think about Arctic winter. And I think when we think about the pristine nature of the Antarctic, we often think about Antarctic winter. And I think that's something that we need to maybe change our consciousness around what the Arctic is. It's not just a pristine white environment that doesn't change and it isn't connected to our world. There's a teleconnectedness of what happens in the Antarctic, what happens in the Antarctic will affect the rest of the world that we live in and live on.
So when we sort of throw around these words Antarctic and the Arctic, do we mean everything that's further north or south of 60 degrees, or do we mean something continental, which clearly can't be the case for the Arctic because it's not a landmass? What do we really mean?
Great question. What do we mean? There are multiple different ways of defining the Arctic. I don't know. Do you know how NATO defines the Arctic particularly? There's the 66 degrees north, and I think in the Antarctic it's 60 degrees south, is it? That's right, 60 degrees south. Yeah. But there's also the 10-degree July isotherm, where the average temperature in July doesn't exceed 10 degrees. And there's also the northern tree line extent. So when we think about the Arctic, we don't often think about trees, and that is because under the northern tree line extent definition, there aren't any trees in the Arctic. It's the three ways I can think of. There are other ways, of course, as well.
And I guess increasingly more as time goes by, I guess, as different activities happen. Dylan, what would you say about previous international agreements? I mean, you've worked quite closely, I think, with a lot of different governmental bodies, haven't you? And I just wonder if you think previous international agreements, be they the Antarctic Treaty and all the systems around that, or some other international agreements of a less, perhaps that are less lengthy, but have they been fit for purpose, really? Were they ever fit for purpose? Are they fit for purpose now that the ice is melting?
I think that's a really good question. Treaties in general are a collaborative event and are often designed to meet political goals from the groups that are entering into them. And by the nature of the mechanisms by which people negotiate and the political, geopolitical influences that some members of treaties will influence on others, I think it's almost probably fair to say that there's never been a fit-for-purpose treaty in many respects. And those treaties and the goals of those treaties are defined within the times that led up to their signing, principally, in many respects. And as time moves on, inevitably they are likely to become less and less fit for purpose as they go on conceptually. And so I think that these are really important aspects for us to consider internationally about how we're looking to manage and move forwards in terms of the protection of the poles as well as other aspects of the planet from a climate perspective. The concept of driving towards net zero by a date in the future, for instance, is great for communication with the general public, But how those things can be implemented and how countries will adhere to and measure themselves within the various constructs which sometimes they're defining themselves to meet those things will have a completely different output in many respects. And so I've got no idea how to handle those things. Luckily, I focus on the technology more than the human communication and policy aspects. But certainly from my perspective, a more collaborative approach is needed as we move forward thinking about climate change.
So how can technology help us with this challenge we have?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So specifically because of that philosophical concept that I've just spoken about, that because of the collaborative nature of treaties and because of the collaborative nature of how countries as well as people want to protect themselves and those nearest to them, above all other things, it makes sense that as a group of peoples, we're going to be slow to meeting the requirements and needs that of the planet in respect of carbon emissions and climate change. And so, in my opinion, technology is a worthy element to try and focus on when trying to help mitigate those things, both in terms of reducing the influences directly that we can have on the climate, and also, if possible, to counteract some of the effects that we've already had on that, so that we've got tools at our disposal to help effectively manage the climate within the planet as we move forwards.
Have you got anything that you've been working on specifically?
So we founded 2 companies to work in this space, actually. One was an indoor farming company called Liberty Produce, and the goal of that is to effectively grow within a box. And at the first instance, it might make no sense at all to shut out the sunlight and to grow produce within a box. And as it stands right now, from a direct climate and energy perspective, it's still not energy efficient to do that. But when you have controlled that system, you can work on technologies that ultimately will allow for efficiencies to be brought into that. And so we're driving towards, at some point in the future, in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, whereby we can have carbon negative food crops that can feed people around the world. And we founded another company called Future by Insects, which is looking to address a really important issue that society is facing in terms of protein production. So insects are a great source of protein. The European Union has, as well as the UK, has allowed for their use in fish food, and there is great potential for insect supplementation into fish food to reduce the need for soya that currently form a large component of fish foods, and that will have the development of those technologies will hopefully have significant value in terms of reducing pressures on pressures on deforestation, as well as shipping and growing of crops such as soya for exactly those purposes. So a combination of these technologies and many others, hopefully in the future, can lead to the reduction in carbon usage.
I think, Sean, you've been working on technologies, quite a different type of technology, haven't you? Tell us a bit about some of yours.
Absolutely. It boils down to the kind of situational awareness, but actually your point on treaties equally applies. Not simply the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as well, but international agreement, information sharing and cooperation are utterly key to situational awareness. And we're looking at, as part of NATO's digital transformation, looking at what we can do to transform and create a digital ocean, which is basically leveraging all the sensors, not necessarily military, but they can be merchant vessels, they could be weather satellites, they could be sensors to gather oceanographic data, and pull this data together in order to make sense of it, help us monitor the oceans, and also get a sense of what is going on with the impact and actual physical effects of climate change around key points within the ocean. So the idea is to not only gather this big data and use different applications to exploit it, but to give products not only to the military community, as would serve NATO, but also provide this data or the product post-processing to academia, industry, for them to use as well. Which, when you think of the benefits being in what we call the triple helix of defence, industry, and academia, it's going to require collaboration and an understanding across all three of the types of information they would like and when they would like it.
Wow. Dylan, does a council, the Arctic Council, do they really pay heed to climate change in the Arctic? I mean, as I understand, this is a council made up of the countries surrounding the Arctic. Do they pay heed to the climate change there, or are they really just more about how we can use possibly these technology to support life better?
So the Arctic Council is composed of 8 key members, which are the 8 Arctic states, as they were, that have a border with the Arctic Ocean. I think a big driving force, and I guess there's 2 key things that I guess I would consider the Arctic Council, and I think they also consider themselves to do, and that is sort of conservation and ensuring that we do keep a stable Arctic, and the other one is sustainable development. I think that the Arctic Council has been critiqued in the past for having a rhetoric that climate change is a big issue and a big problem, but I think translating that stance into action is particularly difficult. I guess when you think about the interests of the states that are involved in the Arctic Council, you have the United States, you have Russia, 2 of the largest petroleum producers. So translating, I guess, action from what the Arctic Council says and what its position is difficult. I think it's also really important to recognise it and think about the fact that while Indigenous peoples are represented at the Arctic Council, they have a permanent position at the Arctic Council. They are not technically decision makers. So while Indigenous peoples live within the boundaries of the nation states that comprise the Arctic Council, those Indigenous peoples aren't the decision makers themselves. Often the decisions are made quite far away from the Arctic. In some cases, if you think about the United States, for instance, and also Russia, I guess. Moscow is fairly far north, but it's not quite into the Arctic.
And these interests are that you mentioned oil and gas, and mineral reserves as well. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of the Arctic and the Antarctic are a wealth of potential resources, and that is where you have this juxtaposition between development, what you mean by development, and conservation. That's not to say that I don't think Indigenous peoples have a right to potentially use the resources that are within the Arctic regions. There are examples where Indigenous peoples do this. In Alaska specifically, a lot of the North Slope of Alaska does. Indigenous peoples are involved to a greater or less degree in oil. I think that being said, there is always an understanding that the environment needs to come first. So I think that's why you do see a lot of reticence and a lot of caution around resource extraction in the Arctic. And I think in the Antarctic, we see that the Antarctic treaty system prevents that at the moment. And I think perhaps the fact that there are sovereign states within the Arctic that own land and can say that they have ownership over it makes it somewhat more difficult to not police, but ensure that resources stay in the ground, I guess, is the way I would think about it.
So is there evidence that nation states are already trying to reach, let's say, further north and grab tracts of the Arctic? I mean, look at you, Sean, but anybody...
Absolutely. I wouldn't say there's specific evidence of going further forward per se, but there is preparation and manoeuvring and kind of test runs, for want of a better expression. And I suppose, I mentioned the kind of international rules and the international law that does apply in that region still, even without a treaty. But I suppose from a NATO perspective, we are obviously, one of our high-level missions is to preserve the rules-based international system. And, it would be foolish of us to assume that everyone is going to abide by that. So we can expect kind of, not so much land grabs, but obviously moves to secure resources from under the ice as the accessibility increases.
So under the ice in the Arctic being the seabed?
Yes, effectively, yeah.
Wow, because famously there was that flag that the Russians planted, wasn't
Yes.
it, right underneath the North Pole.
Yeah.
When was that? Quite a few years ago, actually.
2007,
Wow,
I might
yes.
say, 2006.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, this is it. Most of, most of the oil and gas extraction in that region would be, under the seabed.
And in the Antarctic?
In the Antarctic, there's actually been a few expeditions, even though it's protected by the Antarctic Treaty. There's been a few expeditions to understand where the kind of natural resources are, and I think my understanding is, I stand to be corrected, that the extraction areas that have been identified were far too difficult in the Antarctic, despite evidence suggesting that there was resources there. They were too difficult to access, and that was maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Do we know if that's still the case?
I haven't heard that they've gone back and tried. Yeah. But again, it's that's protected by the Antarctic Treaty, which is over 50 nations now, isn't it?
I think is it 53 nations in the Antarctic Treaty? Yeah, it's been going for some time, but again, whether it's fit for purpose and how we renegotiate that with the UN is going to be an interesting, particularly given other geopolitical things going on, which we won't necessarily go into today. But I'll stay with you, Sean, for a moment. I mean, I'm interested in how emerging technologies might support operations in these very inhospitable parts of the world. I mean, Angus, you've lived there, you've worn your extra clothing, but you don't just put a bit of insulation around a boat, do you?
Yeah, well, exactly. So there are a lot of buzzwords out there when it comes to new technology that mean all things to all people. We talk about artificial intelligence, big data, quantum. But actually, what we get to do, and what I'm fortunate enough to do in my day job, is actually kind of distill that. And there are many different definitions, etc. But to put things into a perspective, I think it's easier for me to give you an example. So under the ice and underwater is a very hostile environment, and actually communications are incredibly difficult. So when we want to send an autonomous, so unmanned underwater vehicle under the ice for any extended period, it actually has no connection to the outside world. It doesn't have a GCS feed. It doesn't have a command link kind of beyond a mile under the sea. And, it's pretty much literally on its own. And we have to basically RV with those types of vehicles.
RV?
Rendezvous, sorry. It's ex-military, so I'm just... with those vehicles at a certain point in time, and we want them to go and collect a vast amount of big data. So we want, a large processor on board that can actually collect that data with various sensor suites. But with no GPS, you think, well, how on earth is it going to navigate? Effectively, most AUVs have this thing called INS, which is an inertial navigation system. So it basically feels how it moves, okay? And then for those mathematicians in the audience, it'll integrate twice, broadly speaking, for that motion, and it'll be able to predict the point in which it should be at. Now, the sensors, we're looking at putting quantum sensors to monitor the motion of these vehicles.
So quantum sensors being sensors that just really look at, instead of measuring things on a broad scale, like a lot of light, they might measure a particular photon coming from that light. Yeah,
so quantum is just a lot greater sensitivity when it comes to quantum sensing. So instead of having like your ruler at school where you can go down to millimeters, you can go much further down, much higher accuracy of sensing the motion. Therefore, you have a much higher accuracy in terms of where your AUV is going to pop up, which means you can put them on longer missions for longer periods of time with higher confidence that they're going to pop up within a set area that you determined. And that's even based on variations in undersea currents, etc. So quantum is going to be a bit of a game changer for us. And to make it really, really simple, it's probably an order of magnitude more accurate to have quantum sensing helping with those types of inertial navigation systems than the traditional methods. And the traditional methods are still pretty good. And with that, you're going to collect more data. So we're going to rely on machine learning applications really to kind of process that data and kick out the products we want. So we get the products at what we call the speed of relevance, because there's no point in sending it away in the military for 3 months for analysis when we're operating in real time. So we need to know what's going on in that sense.
Ooh. So commercial things, Dylan. Will the commercial world really wake up, do you think, all of a sudden and realise all of these amazing opportunities that that it could invest in the poles? And are we going to have a fight on our hands to regulate matters? What do you reckon?
Well, I think it could be particularly interesting in respect of the northern regions with the opening up of waterways potentially around. That will have direct impact on shipping. For instance, it will provide a route from Asia through to Europe, and with that, with more and more commercial activity, I'm sure that there will be opportunities that will come off the back of that. I mean, entrepreneurial people around the world are looking for mechanisms to try and make money and to explore and do things, and as we're seeing, are sometimes pushing beyond where nation states can themselves, and I see no reason why that trend won't continue. So I guess watch that space.
And then Angus, how will that sit with these Indigenous peoples and the communities?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to kind of reconcile, really. It's important to remember, I think, that communities that are in the Arctic, Indigenous communities in the Arctic, would largely consider themselves to be colonized, and that colonization is a continuing, it's been called a continuing disaster in the Arctic by some academics. So I think when it comes to things like the opening up of the Arctic and then the creation of new frontiers, as we might call them, I think it's important that we maintain the kind of self-determination of Indigenous peoples at the core of whatever happens in the Arctic, that they need to be the decision makers about what they want sustainable development to look like. When it comes to resource extraction, I think we kind of need to remember what the status quo can be with resource extraction, where yes, developing a mine or developing an oil field can bring investment to an area, but that investment is only for X many years, and it, depending on how much expertise is required and depending on how many people have flown into communities, it can very much change what a community is. And I think when it comes to tourism and comes to shipping as well, the Arctic at the moment, my understanding is it's not particularly well prepared for search and rescue. So if we are increasing the amount of shipping that's going into the Arctic, that's something that we also need to ramp up the capability to do that. There are large cruise ships that came to visit the community where I work. If there were to be a maritime disaster near the community where I work, it would be, I can't imagine what it would be like, because they have one Coast Guard boat. It's not kitted out for that kind of thing. That being said, tourism, I think it is an area potentially of sustainable development in the Arctic that, if done well and done properly, could be of considerable benefit to Indigenous communities. There's talk of sort of visitation fees. So cruise ships do go to a number of Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic where I work, and there is talk of having kind of, offloading fees, where if you want to go and visit a certain community, you pay a fee, and that the benefit then goes straight to the community. So I think there are ways where it can be done sustainably, but we need to be very careful about it, I think.
Sounds like the answer I give about space and tourism. Yes, but.
Definitely.
But would NATO get involved in sort of search and rescue, and perhaps not in Arctic Canada, but in other northern waters?
Yeah, well, I mean, in international law, we are duty bound as mariners actually to respond to any kind of SOS or distress call that you may get. The actual specific requirements called SOLAS requirements, and I probably have to look it up for the precise spell out of that acronym. But we're duty bound, and if we're increasing our operations in that region, then if there was a distress call, then NATO would have to be prepared to go and assist as much as possible, basically.
I think that'll be a good time to ask you if you would like to ask any questions to any of our panelists. Anybody would like to give the first question to somebody? Yeah, there's a lady. We've got a microphone. Will come to you. I'm going to point to you. Oh, I think you've been spotted.
Safety of life at sea. I just remembered it.
Thank you. I noticed on the TV with Professor Brian Cox that they can contact and send messages to the Land Rover on Mars, which is millions of miles away, yet we can't easily make contact with a vessel on the surface of the land. Have I missed something here?
You said surface of the land. Do you mean when I was
under the water?
Under the water, yeah. It's literally propagation. So even sending an RF signal to Mars is still radio frequency, and it's still able to propagate. When you send RF underwater, that signal dissipates. Same as you can transmit RF underwater, but it's not as potent or as effective as acoustic. So we generally communicate either with light or acoustic waveforms underneath water to pass data. The distance is less and the data rates are lower. When you talk about sending a signal to Mars, you can do that. There is obviously latency involved. Even with an RF waveform, it is not real time. Obviously, it takes several minutes to communicate, but it can still get there. When it comes to the propagation underneath the water, let's just, for example, say acoustic waveforms, there are different effects on that waveform underwater that make the message over a certain distance kind of illegible or with too many parts of it missing. So it is a more hostile environment to transmit data under the sea than it is through space. And
is there no research going on in that area to improve that?
Yeah, whoever figures that one out will have a huge military advantage undersea. Huge.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, we have two here. Thank you.
Do you think the vegetation in the Arctic and Antarctic could be used in as like a food source for like the world in the future?
That sounds like one for Dylan, possibly.
Yeah, sorry, do I think that, what?
The vegetation in the Arctic and Antarctic, because clearly it can survive in like very hostile environments. So could that be used possibly as a food source in the future?
I mean, that's really interesting. I don't know a great deal myself about vegetation in either of those regions, but to give you an example about of where we are using vegetation in those kinds of spaces is with the use of algae. And I'm sure that there are various algae that are present in both of those regions, at least near where the coastlines. And algae can be used for carbon capture and can be used indirectly as a food source to feed to other things, well, such as the insects that we've been working with and animals. And so it's quite possible that kind of aspect could be used to supplement fish farms or fish food or even other cattle or food produce, which is then utilized to feed humans in one form or another. And of course, potentially, you never know, it could be, you could utilize those things for food production in of themselves. I mean, one thing I would say, though, is that with the changing environment evolving as quickly as it is in those regions, the natural vegetation and the indigenous vegetation is almost certainly going to be coming under significant pressure environmentally because its environment is changing very rapidly.
I like the way you said that, that the algae might be converted into some other food source first, because the European Space Agency tried to make astronauts eat algae, and they weren't very impressed, I don't think. Did you have any other response to that question, Angus?
The only thing that I'm necessarily aware of in the Arctic, the part of the Arctic where I work that you can kind of eat is Arctic sorrel, which it tastes great. It's really nice. It tastes a little bit like rhubarb, but I think to produce that on a mass scale would be very difficult. There are a few initiatives across the Canadian Arctic where there are greenhouses. So there's community greenhouses where they will grow fresh produce for the summer months when there is daylight. I think when we think about the Arctic, we also need to remember there's a lot of the winter months in the Arctic. There is 24 hours of darkness or close to versus 24 hours of daylight in the summer. So creating year-round growing conditions is very difficult. But there are initiatives where communities will grow their own food and their own fresh fruit and vegetables. One reason for that isn't necessarily one reason is concern out of food security. Food insecurity in the Arctic is particularly prevalent. In the Canadian Arctic, it's up to 70% in some Canadian Inuit communities.
So what does that mean? 70% of people don't have access to
So
foods?
they don't have sufficient access to nutritious, healthy foods that allow them to live a healthy everyday life. So it's about 70% across the Canadian Arctic, which is particularly high. That's at least 4 times what it is in the southern Canadian continent or southern Canadian nation. But yes, so there is the potential to grow in the Arctic, but I think long and short of it is industrialization of it is we're quite a way off that, I feel. I don't know.
Yes, lady in red, I think.
Yes, I just had a question regarding food production, and it's maybe less directly related to the Antarctic, but just curious. There are 2 types of ways that I've read about in terms of dealing with food production and its impact on climate. One is going the route that you're describing, which is really driven by technology, and then there's a lot of effort also going into regenerative agriculture, and they seem like 2 very different approaches, so just really curious to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so I think that there is a lot of opportunity for utilizing new technologies to improve and to bring about efficiencies in the supply chain. And some examples of that, for instance, are using traditional agricultural technologies. You have to use a lot of chemical inputs to protect plants from pests and from other environmental factors. But if you can grow those plants and stress them in the right way, all within a controlled environment, they can be grown to be healthy and strong. And so early stage growth of plants, for instance, propagation of plants could be undertaken in enclosed environments before they're put into greenhouses or into the open fields, which could lead to plants that are more resilient and are stronger. And those might then need less other chemical inputs, which can then put less pressure on the environment and the land because of that. Another benefit is in respect of the breeding of new plants and new strains of plants. Because you can grow all year round within these enclosed environments, you can undertake what's called speed breeding. So instead of 1 or 2 crops a year for many plants, particularly grown in the northern and southern regions of the hemispheres, you might be able to get 5 or 6 or 7 sometimes. And so you can turn around and develop new types of crops that are more resilient through natural mechanisms of breeding and filtering from there than you would be able to do otherwise.
One more over here. And then there's a gentleman towards the front.
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding surveillance and the Antarctic, because Russia in the Arctic is, I guess, one of the biggest players when it comes to resource extraction, because they already have ice-strengthened platforms where they get oil and gas and so forth. And in the Antarctic, pretty much every nation, to my knowledge, is running a geological program as well. So this is kind of the program that you need in order to find out if there is valuable resources in the Antarctic. And well, that's my personal opinion. It's just a matter of time until it gets interesting to actually exploit these resources, and then it's only a matter of time in how far this Antarctic Treaty will actually work in mitigating that, or kind of, you know, helping this process to not evolve in a direction where it's actually very harmful to the environment. So I was wondering if, in how far is the Antarctic, figuratively speaking, on the radar of NATO, and how far does Antarctic play a role in everyday, you know, surveillance and strategy thinking, because it might evolve in a direction where you would need this military expertise in this area as well, right? So
yeah,
maybe you could respond to that. Thank you.
No, that's a really good question. So we have to bear in mind that up until now, NATO's area of interest, as agreed by the majority of its members, has been kind of geographically based. You know, the North Atlantic, the Atlantic High North, Baltic, and then through to the Eastern Med and the Black Sea. Now, there is a change in thinking, although it's not rippled right the way through, and you'll see the other side of the World Leaders Summit, which is actually at the end of this month. The Secretary General is talking about a more global outlook, and that's because there are more things that affect the collective security of NATO and its members that are out with the geographical confines. Now, I think the Antarctic, to be perfectly honest, is probably way down the list of those considerations. But when you, you know, think about what Dylan said before about the waterways, there is an acknowledgement about how much effect these sea lines of communication have on the security of NATO's, the NATO nations. For example, there have been papers written on the fact that if you shut the Straits of Hormuz, if they were mined, within 2 to 3 weeks, the lights would go out in some Western countries and the gas stations would run out of gas.
Oh, I think you should say that again, actually. My goodness. If you shut the Straits of Hormuz within how long?
So there are academic papers. Obviously, this is an academic theory. There is theories that if you shut the Straits of Hormuz within a matter of a few weeks, there would be pressure on gas stations and power stations in the Western world in terms of keeping the lights on and keeping their economies fueled up. And so that's one example. And then there are several other examples that I could go into, but the point is the global outlook of NATO is a shift that is only really just beginning to happen with and be fed into some high-level strategic documentation, which is being negotiated by the member nations in the summit this year and probably for the next couple of years. And it boils down to, as I said at the start, the understanding that collective security is far more these days than just protecting, your own house and your back garden. There are so many second and third order effects of events that happen globally that will have a big impact on the allied nations, of which in the future, potential competition in the Antarctic might be one.
Interesting question, thank you. And I promised a question to the gentleman here, and then I think we have to, if we can be very quick, please.
Thank you. I'd like to refer to the subtitle of your talk, of the event, Join the Fight Against Exploitation in the Arctic. So I've got two parts of my question. The first part is, what are we, members of the public in the audience, able to do in this fight against exploitation? But the other part is, from what you were saying about the exploitation, I get the impression it is happening, and I don't see nation states, I don't see NATO, corporations, entrepreneurs actually fighting against the exploitation, which at the end of the day contributes to increased climate change and sense of despair for the rest of us. If my impression is wrong, then please correct it. Thank you.
Do you want to start off, Dylan, on what can we do possibly?
Well, I'd say in the first instance, increasing awareness is the first drive there, and then in respect of where the commercial world can interface with these aspects, I think it's the general public often has direct input into mitigating and controlling that, more so than nation states. And so my personal opinion in that matter is that the more that you can bring a financial value around the protection of the world and aspects of that, such as the Arctic, the more security can be brought around by that in respect of, ultimately, people like to make money and want to make money. And if money can be utilized positively, then there is a construct that we've got, capitalism, that works quite effectively, that can allow for that. How that can fit within this changing environment, obviously I don't know, and how nation states will interface with that aspects, I don't know either. But for instance, the permafrost is melting. There are opportunities there for either significant methane release into the atmosphere, or that can be captured through one form or another. And if it were captured, then it's not going to be used in the atmosphere. Now, whether it's commercially possible or practical, I've got no idea. But I could see that as a potential for a commercial entrepreneurial output, potentially driven by the indigenous communities there, to work with groups that could harness that technology.
Does anybody else want to answer quickly?
Yeah, I mean, very, very quickly, NATO wants to protect the rules-based international system, and therefore, what it does and how it acts is actually within that and in the protection of that. And we talked about the treaty in the Antarctic, and I talked about some of the IMO regulations and UN Clause 3 actually applying in the Arctic. But there is a question around, do we have the right international laws in place, as a whole within both regions to enable the other international organizations and, in fact, nations to protect and actually fight against anything that might be not necessarily illegal at this stage, but kind of, unjust and also detrimental to the environment in nature, even if that is out with the current rules that we have.
I think, Angus, you were about to join in.
I think perhaps I would say that I think the Arctic Council and the Antarctic Treaty System generally do work well and generally do have conservation at that is one of their core ideals. The Antarctic Treaty, for instance, it would be very difficult to extract resources from Antarctica prior to 2048. Any change to the Antarctic Treaty System requires approval by all voting members. There are currently 29 voting members, so every single one of those would, in theory, have to agree to resource extraction. So unless someone were to go rogue and break that treaty, which again would have much wider geopolitical ramifications, and I think in the Arctic, something that needs to happen and is starting to happen is, as I've said before, the self-determination of Indigenous peoples, and perhaps their stance in the Arctic Council and what say they have needs to change, whether that needs to be that they have voting rights within the Arctic Council over exactly what happens. It is a good question. And I think finally, when you mentioned that what can we as the public do and how can we try and join the fight against exploitation in the Arctic, one thing is that we need to stop thinking about the Arctic as somewhere that's far away and disconnected from us. The climate and the CO2 that we put out into the atmosphere, when I say this as the public, I mean the nation of Great Britain as a whole, in terms of our industries and what our politicians do. All of those things affect what is happening in the Antarctic. So I think remaining cognizant of that and essentially trying to pressure, however we do it, our politicians to ensure that we are taking steps to mitigate, or if we can't mitigate, certainly adapt to climate change, is super important.
Thank you, and a great question to finish off. Thank you very much. And that I've got now just under 1 minute to bring us to the end of the session, to thank you for those great questions and to thank our panelists. Angus, Sean and Dylan, not necessarily in that order. It's been wonderful talking with you today, and apologies to you if you wanted to ask a question and we couldn't get round to you. I'd also like to thank again Imperial College London's Institute for Security, Science and Technology for initiating this panel, and to the festival organisers, especially James Romero in this case and Mitchell Clark, for coordinating. And before you leave the Royal Geographical Society here, do check out the adult zone. I'm told there's a whole load of activities there that are quite fun. The festival, though, as a whole, continues until 6 o'clock today, so do get out there and explore the full programme of talks, workshops and stands. Otherwise, that's it from me. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.